Through the words of Aristotle, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. I'm Sharavan M. from First M English. I'm here to present Poetics, chapter 25 by Aristotle. Aristotle. He was born on 384 BC, Stragira, Chalcidice. He was a Greek philosopher and polymath during the classical period in ancient Greece. He was a disciple of Plato and a teacher of Alexander the Great. He was composed on many subjects, including physics, spirituality, poetry, drama, music, logic, political science, ethics, and biology. He was produced the first comprehensive work on Western philosophy, which is combined policy, logic, science, politics, and spirituality. His views on physics had a huge impact on medieval education and had an impact on the Renaissance. It was eventually replaced by Newton's materialism. In biology, some of his concepts were confirmed in the 19th century. His logics are relevant even today. His spiritual works influenced Islamic and Jewish thoughts in the medieval ages, and they continue to influence Christians, especially the Roman Catholic Church today. His philosophy is still taught in high class today. Aristotle had composed many works in which many were destroyed. Aristotle's famous treatise on politics is Poetics. Aristotle's Poetics, chapter 25. Aristotle's Poetics seeks to address the different kinds of poetry, the structure of a good poem, and the division of a poem into its component parts. He defines poetry as a medium of imitation that seeks to represent a duplicate life through character, emotion, or action. Aristotle defines poetry very broadly, including epic poetry, tragedy, comedy, dithyrambic poetry, and even some kind of music. Aristotle's criticism. Aristotle lays out the terms in which poetry can be evaluated. From the outset, he recognizes that the standard of correctness and effectiveness that we apply to the language of poetry are not the same as those we use to evaluate other arts or even other use of language. For example, political speeches. His approach to criticism corresponds to basic assumption that all art is mimic. Many of his remarks address the success of a work in representing perceived reality. Faults in poetic works can be organized into two general categories: essential faults that impact the work as a whole, and accidental faults, such as factual errors that may be irritating, distracting, and disappointing, but do not indicate a failure of artistic skill. All errors should be avoided, Aristotle asserts, but he seems interested in establishing fair conditions for criticism. Throughout this chapter, he reflects on why each of the 5 criticisms might be referred, stressing that critics must always bear in mind the self-consistency and purpose of the work as a whole. Aristotle does not appear to address these errors in any particular order and does not directly address the issue of moral harm. Book 24 goes on to cover 5 subcategories of faulty representation: impossibility, irrationality, moral harmfulness, contradiction, and failure to conform to artistic rules. Impossibility. Aristotle urged that poets should not, in general, depict impossible events, but that if the impossible event serves the artistic purpose, there is no fault in it. Magical realist fiction might be a contemporary example of this kind of work. Aristotle reminds us that the probable is only probable and that in reality, improbable events really do occur sometimes. Minor factual errors representing a female deer as having antlers, for example, should not be grounds for dismissing the whole work. Irrationality. Irrational behavior in a character can be justified in the same way as an impossible event. If it is necessary to the plot to have a character behave erratically, such a representation is justified. Gratuitous badness in character, however, should be condemned. Contradiction. When we met with apparent contradictions in a work of art, we must apply careful methods of analysis to determine whether the word or phrase that seems to contradict an earlier expression in fact has the meaning we are assigning it. Aristotle suggests that we credit the author with enough intelligence to avoid blatant contradiction until we are convinced that inconsistency is in fact a mistake and not an artistic strategy. Failure to conform to artistic rules. Before we conclude that a passage is poorly written or that a speech is inconveniencing, we must examine the context of the passage in question to determine if this apparent fault serves some particular purpose in the work. A clumsy, inconveniencing speech may perfectly suit the character who delivers it. Careful attention to the way a poet is using language may reveal that a phrase or passage that appears confusing or nonsensical, if in fact metaphorical or intentionally ambitious, or has some other function in support their representation. These are all the general things about Aristotle's Poetics. Aristotle's Tragedy and Comedy. Aristotle's Tragedy. Aristotle's Poetics is the first attempt to define the characteristics of tragedy and its effects upon the Sophoclean drama, since he regards this as the mature form of tragedy. Aristotle defines tragedy as an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude, in language embellished with each kind being found in separate parts of the play in the form of action, not of narrative, through pity and fear, affecting the proper purgation of these emotions. Tragedy came from the efforts of poets to present men as nobler or better than they are in real life. Aristotle's Comedy. Comedy, on the other hand, shows a lower type of person and reveals humans to be worse than they are in average. Epic poetry, on the other hand, imitates noblemen like tragedy, but only has one type of meter, unlike tragedy, which can have several and is narrative in form. Aristotle lays out 6 elements of tragedy, components in order of importance, explanation, and question for analysis. The components are plot, character, thought, diction, song, and spectacle. Aristotle's Tragedy and Epics. Tragedy and epic poetry fall into the same categories: simple and complex, ethical or pathetic. There are a few differences between tragedy and epic. However, first, an epic poem does not use song or spectacle to achieve its cathartic effort. Second, epics often cannot be presented at a single sitting, wherever tragedies are usually able to be seen in a single viewing. Finally, the heroic measure of epic poetry is hexameter, where tragedy often uses other forms of meter to achieve the rhymes of different characters' speech. Aristotle also lays out the elements of successful imitation. The poet must imitate either things as they are thought to be, or things as they ought to be. The poet must also imitate in action and language. Errors come when the poet imitates incorrectly and thus destroys the essence of the poem, or when the poet accidentally makes an error. Aristotle does not believe that factual errors sabotage the entire work. Errors that limit or compromise the unity of a given work, however, are much more consequential. Conclusion. Aristotle concludes by tackling the question of whether the epic or tragic form is higher. More critics of his time urged that tragedy was for an inferior audience that requires the gesture of performers, while epic poetry was for a cultivated audience, which could filter a narrative form through their own imaginations. Interplay. Aristotle notes that epic recitation can be merged by overdone gesticulation in the same way as a tragedy. Moreover, tragedy, like poetry, can produce its effect without action. Its power is in the mere reading. Aristotle urged that tragedy is, in fact, superior to epic because it has all the epic elements as well as spectacle and music to provide an intelligent pleasure for the audience. Tragedy then, despite the arguments of other critics, is the higher art for Aristotle. Thank you.